All right, so today I am here with Rio Larmand, Cosmic Wizard Astrology on Instagram. And we're going to be talking about human design, astrology, true sidereal astrology, other sidereal astrologies, true sidereal human design. I mean, how this conversation came to be, in the past 2 weeks, I've had more emails and more questions about human design because of true sidereal, which I think came out in mid-December by Richard Mason, his system of true sidereal human design. And it must have taken a month or two to kind of escalate because it's reached this critical mass now where I can't open Instagram without getting 10 messages about it. I have all of my old clients asking me, can I run a chart, what this and that, and on Facebook. And then there's a lot of really angry people out there. It's been quite a journey, and Richard's been a great sport about it. Rio, you've been wonderful as well on the Cosmic Human Design Facebook group, helping keep the peace and also just helping to chime in and add insights where possible. And things got a little tense for a while, but I think they've reached a good point. I'll be talking to Richard next week, which I'm really excited about, and he asked me to promise him. I always find that the defined ego always asks people to make promises. He said to promise him that I would give him a chance to state his side of everything. And I said, well, I don't make promises, but I can tell you that my desire more than anything is actually for clarity and is for learning and education. I don't have the cross of education in my chart. It's not my incarnation cross, but I do have it through secondary placements. It's kind of a hidden incarnation cross, if you will. So I love education, and I see part of my role as educating. So thank you so much for being here, and let's get edumacated. I'm excited to learn about it. So tell me a little, how did you first get into astrology? What is your background in astrology?
Okay, well, I started learning about astrology in 2008. That's when I learned that it was more than just sun signs, right? And so from that point on, I would run my own chart a little bit, and it took me some time to actually learn what any of it meant, And I've sort of been on and off studying it for about 10 years. And then I guess, well, no, it was about 2 years ago now. I saw something and it was something silly. It was like a meme, basically, that was like, what if tropical is just the language of the matrix and we got to go back to the stars? And it was just something silly. And at the moment, I gave it no thought, but it planted this tiny little seed in my head. And from a bit after that, I started just getting curious. I'm wondering, why doesn't it line up with the stars, And before, when I was still learning and I didn't know that much and I was just teaching myself, I was told that's the way it is. And so that's the way I did it, And so I started looking at the moon cycle and comparing the two and be like, okay, tropical says this, sidereal says this. And I just felt into it for a solid 2 years, not really making any conclusions, but just checking it out to see. And 2 years later, I'm a convert, that the stars do matter and that it is a little more resonant to the energy that I feel is playing out within my life and the stories that are playing out on the grand scale of humanity. And so from that sparked a curiosity within me of okay, well, if the stars matter, then don't all the stars matter, because that was sort of, if we're talking about true sidereal, that's this idea that maybe there's a 13th sign because there's a 13th constellation that is near the ecliptic, right? Mm-hmm. And so at this point, I'm just in a very open space of curiosity. And I've been drilling down on this curiosity a little deeper over the past couple of months, pretty much, is where I'm at.
Oh, I love that. Yeah, no, I love that. I have a similar, a similar desire to really I'm not really interested in information for information's sake. It's funny. I don't know if you're familiar with the modality of Enneagram. I talk about that on my channel sometimes too.
I've
I'm a
heard
one.
about it, but
Yeah.
and like I hear people mentioning it a lot, mostly people who are Enneagram 4s, but
Well, and that's kind of like the INFJ for Myers-Briggs, or, there's certain ones where that's something I really love about astrology and human design, is that you don't get to choose what you are, just
oh
there's
yeah,
no debate.
true.
But no, but I mean, you can choose how to interpret it, of course. But in any case, I was going to mention that just for other viewers of the channel who know that I've done Enneagram work and kind of understanding my agenda. In Enneagram, the Enneagram 5 is purely interested in things for kind of their sake. And I'm really not. I actually do have an agenda. My type, the 1, is actually one of the anger types, which tends to get a lot of anger about things and then use that to try to reform and try to change. A lot of it is channeled into social justice. I'm pretty active in that department and kind of trying to change systemic racism, end systemic racism, and systemic sexism, and abuses and things like that. But a lot of it is also, it goes into what might not be so apparent as a social cause. For instance, I was pretty big in the astrology community before kind of transitioning to human design. And so I would go to astrology conferences. And in 2018, I went to the United Astrological Conference, where I attended talks by Glenn Perry. And I was one of the only people in the audience. And you might be familiar with Glenn because he was the one who was kind of lambasted and ostracized for his negative remarks about sidereal astrology. And so to bring it back, just as an example, on the one hand, when I kind of witnessed that and I saw, okay, I mean, I do feel that there is some Western Eurocentric privilege going on that tends to be privileging a lot of psychological models of astrology and going against fatalistic astrology and against predictive astrology and things like that as kind of lesser or more primitive or more, and a lot of that can actually be Eurocentrism, because guess what? Most of the fatalistic astrologies are practiced in India and other places, right? So on the one hand,
astrology, like it's supposed to be linked to the seasons. It only works for half the planet.
Right. And only, yeah, exactly. So, I mean, that as well. I mean, well, we can, it's still linked to the seasons. It's exactly inverse. But I mean, but at the same time, I guess what I'm going to say is, so I kind of went into the whole Glenn Perry debacle kind of wanting to, and also I had a good friend, my buddy Rick at that time, who was Rick Levine, who I've known for years from Seattle. We've hung out a ton, and he lives out in, where is it out? Kind of out in Redmond, outside of Seattle. But in any case, an old friend of mine, and we've spent countless hours debating and talking and laughing and stuff. And he was very much on the ban Glenn Perry parade. And so then I started to kind of see all of this feeding frenzy around Glenn Perry. And then I looked at what Glenn Perry had said. I think Glenn made a real mistake, and I've talked to him also. And I talked to him last week. We still communicate.
But what did he say? Because I'm not versed.
Well, that's what I'm getting to it. Yeah, I'm kind of building the context. So I think the place he said it was wrong, but I'll tell you what he said. What he said was that effectively, and he has the talk's still online. So to paraphrase or summarize his talk, what he said was, there's about 15 different sidereal calculation schools out there, and that all of them are going to give slightly different charts that change in different ways. But that what they all have in common is that they're all basically, I mean, to summarize, they're basically wrong. They're basically, which is a very controversial thing to say. Now, from his perspective, that they're basically referring to different signs half the time, or 2/3 of the time, or 3/4 of the time, and the rest of it is kind of fudged. And he made, I mean, I won't really put words in his mouth, but it seemed to be that he was saying that the reason that sidereal is working is because it doesn't touch the aspects and it doesn't touch the planetary positions. All it touches, well, it doesn't. I mean, all the aspects are identical, regardless of what system you use. Aspects never change. And so, you're still like, and actually that may be up to 30% or more of the time, it actually doesn't change the sign. So he was like, it's basically kind of accidentally working some of the time. Pretty rude, right? Pretty rude to be saying that.
About tropical, but
well, yeah, but the thing is, like, and I think it was rude that he said it at he was invited and paid an honorarium. So were a lot of other Western astrologers to go to fly to India, and he gave this talk in India. So that's why. So that's why. If he said that in San Francisco, nobody bats an eyelash. But the fact that he said it to a room of sidereal astrologers, but he also, kudos to him for pointing out the elephant in the room. Nobody else even addressed it, and they're all talking about the signs as if it's the same. And here's Rick Levine, who his whole life has been an Aries, and they're telling him there's no chance in hell you're an Aries. You're nothing like an Aries. And yet he's just completely glossing over it and pretending it doesn't exist. And Glenn is saying, how can you be so disingenuous to pretend that the sign is the same? Right? Like, how can Rick be getting paid money to give a talk to a bunch of people who don't even think he's an Aries, when his whole life he's been saying he's an Aries, and he'll never admit he's not an Aries, right? I mean, so it's really weird. It's a very complex situation. But I guess what I'm going to say is, so that was my first time ever getting invested in sidereal. Like, I knew about it as an intellectual curiosity. I did my sidereal charts. I even did a sidereal human design chart way back in the day because I'm a programmer. I made it myself. But this was the first time it became political to me. At this point, I thought, okay, this is really thorny. Glenn is a white dude, Eurocentric, paid money, disrespecting people in India, and at the same time also pointing out a bunch of shit that, pardon me, but a lot of people are just accepting the money and smiling and pretending that these conflicts don't exist. And to me, that's intellectually disingenuous, and it shows poor scholarship. And I've tried to hold people to account for that. I mean, at UAC in 2018, it was one of the big conversations. There were two big topics. One was the Leo King, who was disinvited. He's another good friend of mine, David. And he was disinvited. And so he was one of the big topics. And then the other was Glenn Perry, who was still allowed to talk, but everybody boycotted him. And very few people were there. And there were like mountains of negative comments calling for him to be banned and disinvited and things like that. So that's my background on it. And then when I saw it with Richard Mason, I thought, okay, wow, this really brings up a lot of interesting things. I mean, it brings up, again, a lot of the same stuff as with Glenn Perry. It also brings up a lot of language problems. I think it was David Chalmers who defined a language dispute as a dispute that is purely based on words. And I did the thought experiment that if Glenn Perry literally had 12 different names for his tropical signs, and he said, oh, everybody who's a zonk is like this, and everybody who's a zilp is like that, because I have something I want to say really quick. It's just, for me, how I learned astrology was creating a bucket and putting things in that bucket. And the bucket is Pisces, or the bucket is Mars square Neptune, or the bucket is whatever, and some of the harder ones like quincunxes and stuff, I create a bucket for it and I keep trying to put stuff in it. And if I don't find enough to put in it, I go, well, maybe somebody else can figure out quincunx. It's not for me. That's basically what Rick Tarnas said. He doesn't really use anything. He doesn't use signs. He doesn't use anything. He uses only planets, and mostly only the synodic cycles. And he said, look, I'm not knocking signs. I'm not knocking houses. I'm not knocking any of that stuff. This is just what I'm good at,
That's what I find is the most useful, right? Because that's the part that isn't in major dispute, the aspects are always going to be the same. House systems, honestly, from what I can see, are kind of a mess. I keep trying to ask people, like, it's hard to find information on like why things are the way they are, and a lot of people, they're taught that this is how they do it. And so they use the house system that their teachers taught them, and that's how it is. But so I don't know, myself, I'm just like questioning a lot. And in my readings and stuff, I agree where like put the focus a little bit on things that are constant.
Well, and if we believe that there's a sort of fractal repetition of this cosmic intelligence, it would make sense to me that some people are better at reading houses, some are better at reading sidereal, and also that they may in fact be detailing different levels of the psyche and of the physis of the actual physical world. That's something else, was that, when I learned house systems, I learned the 12 sign alphabet, which is kind of, first house, Aries, Mars. And now with Hellenistic astrology, for instance, people like Jen Zart and Chris Brennan are really fighting to kind of undo that 1970s predominantly West Coast American invention and to try to get back to houses that are not simply corollaries to the, not all 12s are the same. The 12 houses are not just, so I'm kind of like that too. And I can definitely accept that, you know, there are ways to get useful information out of patterns with astrology that I know nothing about. And I mean, the proof's in the pudding. You know, Sidereal does work. I mean, it works in a predictive capacity. I've heard similar things from Chris Brennan and people who are doing that kind of Hellenistic game of like whole sign houses are kind of predictive or fatalistic. And then all of the later developments of the houses, you actually look at the astrological chart or the kind of movement of when that house system was developed, and you see, okay, this was the burgeoning psychologization of astrology, moving from a predictive technique to a psychological technique. And you see that, okay, well, a great example would be for me, I have a 12th house moon in Taurus, which is my ascendant. So in whole sign is first house. So historically, throughout most of history, I would have been a moon in the first house, wear my heart on my sleeve. It's almost, you know, a non-psychological version of it. But if you actually understand my psyche, you'll realize I have very guarded emotions and so that, you know, so they kind of both work. Now, this is actually maybe a good segue to true sidereal human design, because a number of people have kind of tried to make the claim maybe they both work and they're both working on different things. And I still disagree with that. But again, I have buckets. I mean, again, how I learn astrology, how I've always learned astrology, anything, I make a bucket and I just keep filling it and I see the proof's in the pudding. And sometimes it takes me years to know. I mean, I can't say now, but it's a similar kind of thing. Right?
There's a couple points that I'd like to make about astrology before we start talking about human design, just because
absolutely
that's not my area of study, you know? And so the key difference between so-called true sidereal and like sidereal in the much more traditional sense is that like it's more focused on, not all the signs are necessarily the same amount of space, right? Because in any zodiac, whether it's tropical or sidereal, traditionally, every sign is accorded 30 degrees of space. And so true sidereal is like radical return to more like old Babylonian style, where they had like 18 signs that were all different shapes or shapes, sizes, and the different, you know.
Yeah, no, I'm completely with you.
Makes it a lot harder, right? There's a theory that I think is interesting in that, like obviously the shift would have been made to simplify things, but also around when this was happening, you know, like in Europe, they reached a point where a lot of people weren't very numerate, you know, and breaking things down into much more divisible, you know, it's tropical and even like traditional sidereal is an extremely neat and tidy system, you know, which is good. But I think the question that a lot of us are asking is maybe like, in an attempt to make a neat and tidy system, did we move away from a little bit of like the wisdom that's actually coming down to us, you know?
Which is very similar to the move of Hellenistic astrology, which has really gained a lot in the past 10 years. I'd recommend anyone interested in that to look at Chris Brennan's podcast, because he's kind of a star there. But there's many others who are kind of in this movement of, yeah, maybe we should do what James Hillman called cultural retrieval, to go back and find what, you know, what was oversimplified. Yeah, same thing with the 12 sign alphabet. We've oversimplified, you know, the 7th house to be Libra, to be Venus, but actually it's also about enemies. Venus doesn't like conflict. Libra doesn't like conflict. So what are enemies doing there? You know, so obviously it has to do with something else than just Libra. So a couple things about that. So one is, I am familiar with 13 and 14 sign versions. They do predate true sidereal, but I understand that true sidereal has a different delineation. But the one thing I do want to share, pardon?
Yeah, this is a sort of reignition of that.
Yeah, but there have been a few. I mean, there's a really great webpage I found doing a little research on this, which has about 20 different systems. And basically the two changes that sidereal can do, it can either do one change or the other, or both. The one change is to modify the start of a sign, like where we put 0 degrees Aries. And that's the change where true sidereal is it's 3 degrees different than what human design does, but it applies the calculation twice. So it's actually ends up being, it's hard to describe, but basically true sidereal, like we'll table that discussion until we get into human design. But from what I can understand, true sidereal has a fixed 26 degree offset. I'm going to get clarity with this next week with Richard Mason. So the one thing is the offset. The other is, do you change the degrees of the signs, right? Do you say that Scorpio is actually tiny and Ophiuchus is like big, or do you got a 14th sign?
Exactly.
So,
From what I understand in true sidereal, that's the aim, right?
Well, there's two, they're changing both, but not when it comes to human design. There's only one thing has changed for human design. So in astrology, true sidereal, as far as I understand it, now I generated a true sidereal chart that did not show me my extra signs. So I believe you can either choose to see the extra signs or not, depending on if you want to.
It's quite confusing, like as someone who's just getting into it. Like there's some softwares that make the calculations based on midpoints, which, might be fair because there's some crossover in the constellations, and then there's other softwares that make the calculations based on like NASA measurements. I don't know. I'm really wanting to sort of.
I just used the first website. If I looked up true sidereal astrology, there's a website that comes up, and I generated my chart there. Pardon?
Is it Mastering the Zodiac, Athens site?
Yes, Mastering the Zodiac.
Mm-hmm.
So that one only uses the 12 signs, right?
Really?
Well, the chart I generated, it might be an option. The chart I generated, I didn't see an extra, maybe there's an extra sign there. Well, in any case, I guess what I'm trying to say is, well, yeah, but I guess what I was going to say is that there's already a sort of, there's two things that the sidereal is doing, and I think that any sidereal system can do. And the first is modifying the degrees of the signs. And that's kind of the conventional, like 12, all the 12 sign systems, that's all they do. Yeah, and the amount they modify by, so just for context for our viewers, the amount they modify by is basically, there's a number of different rationales for this, but some of them, like one guy modifies by 38 degrees because he looks at a great conjunction at 2000 BC. Another person looks at 600 BC great conjunction, which is what Rick Tarnas states is the kind of beginning of our modern era. It's the Pluto, Neptune, Uranus triple conjunction of 600 BC. And that's the point where he starts it. And so that modifies by that number of degrees. Most people go around 0 AD, which is when 0 degrees of Aries was of the tropical sign, 0 degree Aries on spring equinox was also roughly, because there's no precision, because there's no precise delineation in constellations, roughly where Aries was in the sky. So that's kind of the most common one, is around 23 degrees. So this is what Ra uses. So Ra was told in his epiphany or his experience to use a very precise calculation, which is about the Fagan-Bradley. I've actually asked a number of old school human design folks just exactly to confirm it, but I did the math myself, and I did the math. And so in human design, the global cycles are all because of the sidereal movement against the tropical. And the calculation, basically, it's changing all the time. The drift is always increasing, because the drift is not fixed. Although interestingly, it does seem Richard is using a fixed number. So that's another reason I want to ask him about why his number doesn't seem to change. But in any case, when human design is constantly changing, right now we're at almost exactly 22 degrees and 56 minutes of drift. And on February 15th, 2027, it precisely moves into 23 degrees exactly of drift between sidereal and tropical. So that's one of my big questions for him next week, is just why 26 degrees? Why not 23? And then one of his main proponents told me that he uses a 22 degree offset. And I said, that can't be right. He's using 26 for mine, so a lot of the questions around why 26 and not 23. And then I had someone say, well, it doesn't really matter because it's close enough. And I disagree. Because I do believe, sure, there's cusps, but you can still be off on the cusp. I mean, I think that 3 degrees is 3 degrees. It's not nothing, especially when we look at the human design wheel, which has 384 lines around 360 degrees. So it's less than 1 degree per line. And so to actually get an accurate profile requires knowing less than 1 degree of precision of accuracy.
Well,
so yeah.
I definitely used to subscribe to I don't think good enough is reason enough to change everything on one hand. But on the other hand, I definitely used to subscribe to the idea that like their cusps weren't really a thing. And, one was one sign and one was the other. But as I've started to sort of look at things more constellationally,
That's a good word. I let it pass. I let it pass. Okay.
There is a lot of overlap, like where we are. I mean, not at the moment, but where we are recently with the sun, like it was sort of questionable, like Capricorn or Aquarius, even looking at the constellations, But yeah, I don't know.
Well, yeah, and then that's also the question. So, because one of the theories put forth in the Cosmic Human Design group doing True Sidereal is that, okay, so I actually have two things I want to mention this. This will be great. So two theories that were put forth. One is that normal, conventional, tropical human design is conscious, and that sidereal, true sidereal is unconscious, map of the unconscious. I disagree.
I hear that about astrology too.
Pardon?
I don't know what about it. I hear that a lot of the times about like tropical versus sidereal too. Like one's ego and one's the soul.
Self, or yeah. No, I disagree with that, and I can explain why in a moment. But that's my first disagreement. And then my second one, the second story I've heard is that conventional human design is masculine, and that sidereal is a return of the divine feminine. And I mention this because the feminine is often thought to be holistic and nonlinear and sort of emergent, and maybe we can't actually get precise. Maybe precision is a masculine concept or a masculine myth or fantasy, and so on. And the real messy world out there doesn't actually work like that. Well, the reason that I disagree with both of those when it comes to the true sidereal human design is first, to set the stage for it. I have a worldview, which is basically it emerged through human design, but it's the worldview of fractal lines. Fractal lines are a big term in human design, and on the one hand, it's used to describe things like trajectory, how like a small decision, kind of like the butterfly effect type thing, or how people end up meeting each other, find each other. On the other hand, trajectory has a very specific meaning of being the farther away from a mutative creation you get, the more it's like you get euphemistic and metaphorical, and you lose a lot of the precision of the precise image of the thing itself. It's very similar to James Hillman's theory that you have a vision or a dream or an image. That's the most precise it will ever be. Then you start to use a bunch of words and concepts, and it gets vague. And philosophers get it backwards, and they think that their concept is precise. Really, the image is the only precise thing we have. So similarly, Ra will say things like, well, you have a mystical experience, and it creates a new mutative school, and then the individual mutative experience gets taken over by tribal infighting, and then becomes a collective system, and it actually reminds me of Carl Jung's favorite story of all of his myths and legends. He was asked to say his very favorite one, and Jung's favorite was of this water of life, the agua vita, that came up out of the ground and nourished people, and they discovered it, but then pretty soon they started fighting over it. And then they had a system around it and a religion and an order, and then the water dried up, but nobody noticed because they were too busy fighting and selling, and the water went somewhere else.
Yeah.
And so what I feel like with human design is that it was a mutative, truly new. And this is interesting because I was talking to Chris Brennan, who's such an old school traditionalist from Hellenistic astrology, and I expected him to be so closed off to human design. This was at the Northwest Astrological Conference in 2017, and he wasn't at all. He said, "Oh, everything for the Hellenistic astrologers was revelatory. It was 100% revelation." That's what it was. It was direct experience, which doesn't really have proof or evidence or anything. It's just a direct experience. So what's interesting to me, and kind of why I want to talk about and how I set the stage with the masculine feminine dichotomy and the conscious unconscious dichotomy. And I'll try to do it summarized. I know I can be kind of long-winded, but let's start with the conscious unconscious dichotomy. Now, human design, actually, when Ra kind of first laid out the chart, he said, this is the first time ever the unconscious has been mapped. And this guy, Jürgen, who's one of the early assistants of Ra, who helped him, was a Jungian and graduated from the Zurich Jung Institute and brought human design to the Jungians to present, and of course was laughed out of there and get lost, But in any case, Ra's first big discovery, what he kind of felt was, wow, for the first time ever, he basically said early on, astrology isn't wrong. Astrology is just describing how the mind operates. It's describing everything about our personality and about how the personality operates. And now we see that basically with this 88-degree calculation, you actually have your unconscious has a personality too. And it's basically square. I love that. I love the fact that your unconscious is basically square to your conscious because the sun is 88 degrees off. Now, right, but I've actually done, and I would highly recommend anyone who has an astrology background to take their design date. You can find the UTC of it, make a new chart, born in London, UK, give it the design date, because that's the GMT 0, give it the design date and actually see what your other is. Because the theory of human design is there are two souls. It's an ancient theory. It's the Phoenician theory, really. They actually had two burial rites, two souls, the personality and the design. And the personality is the eternal soul and the design is the temporary soul. And the eternal soul and the temporary, the bodily soul kind of unite. And that is what creates.
So human design, which is the temporary?
The temporary is the design. It's the one that's linked to your particular body. But the eternal soul has many bodies as it continues to reincarnate. And so it's kind of like there's a body soul and then there's the mind soul, if you will, or the personality soul. And the body soul lives here in the G center and the mind soul floats around up here. I'm being facetious, but it's
there's a super interesting, I've heard that it's like a Jewish myth. I don't know the specifics, but there's this really cool myth that I've thought of so many times in relation to the soul. And that is like, before you're incarnated, you know everything, you remember everything, you know why you're coming to earth, what your mission is, what you're agreeing to, all that. And then an angel goes boop and makes this tiny little doot right here.
Oh, this thing, the dimple.
Yeah, that's what makes the little mark, and then you forget.
Oh, fantastic. Perfect. I love it. That's a good one. I really love that. Yeah. No, I love these kind of classic myths. Oh, I love it. But yeah, so, and without going too deep into the human design cosmology, I guess the thing is, the idea of fractal lines is that you end up getting more and more metaphorical in that there are direct experiences. I mean, on the one hand, we have the kind of relativistic hall of mirrors that says there's no such thing as a direct experience. On the other hand, we have encounter, like we have people who have revelatory experiences. So there obviously is some sort of ability that at least some humans have to have these transcendental experiences and so on. And I've always been interested in those. I was disappointed to discover that according to Ra, I don't have the circuitry to have a mystical experience myself, which I thought was very, very sad. But which is another, pardon that?
Is that your experience? Have you never had any sort of mystical experience?
I haven't had the kind he's had. I mean, maybe it's for the best. I don't think he would have said I wouldn't be able to, more just that I might not recover from it. I'll put it that way. Certain people are wired to be able to have what would be called psychosis or madness or things like that, and to live through it and survive it. And it's particularly individual circuitry in the chart that grants that, because individual circuitry is all about personal empowerment and is basically kind of hardwired to be empowered. I get empowerment from the individual people in my life. I mean, on the one hand, human design sounds very limiting because it's all this, you're this and not that, and so limiting. On the other hand, it's actually really beautiful because it talks about what we can give each other. Like, I might not be able to empower people or feel empowered myself unless I'm around someone who's individual, and then they kind of impart that on me because I go, wow, I saw how they handled that. They didn't let that person interfere with them. Why am I letting these people interfere with me, or something like that? But in any case, this whole idea of direct experience, kind of the fountain of life, the aqua vita, the direct experience, the revelation. For Ra, it kind of coincided roughly with the Sanduleak explosion, which bathed planet Earth in 400,000 times as many neutrinos as had ever been in recorded history. And thus human design was born. So out of this event, we got a couple things. We definitely got the personality versus the design, and that was the first map of the unconscious. And then we also got the understanding of the 7-centered versus the 9-centered being. And the short version of it, because we could talk for hours about this, is simply that according to the human design cosmology, we are actually a mutative new form. And this mutative new form, the 9-centered being, is sort of representative of what they call right variable in human design, which is holistic. It is nonlinear. And it's basically everything that has been attributed to the rise of the divine feminine, to the point that Ra himself even said human design is the system of the divine feminine. It is the yin system. Its entire goal is to embrace the feminine. Ra only gave to one charity, and it was educating women, because he said that women are the ultimate determinants of everything, and that the quality of life for all of humans is dependent on the quality of life of women. And that, the first mystery was how it's not really mysterious that a woman could give birth to a woman, but that the man comes from the woman was the first great divine mystery. How does even the male is feminine, is what Ra said. He said, even what we call the personality crystal is ultimately an expression of yin in the yang form. And so I guess my point in bringing this up is that if you get really deep into the human design cosmology, the two core things that Ra is claiming is the time has finally come to have a map of the unconscious, and the time has finally come to respect the feminine, the form principle, the yin. After thousands and thousands of years, 90,000 years, according to Ra, of the feminine being kept down, not just 4,000 years, but going all the way back 90,000 years, as the ajna developed, and starting with the dropping of the larynx and the beginning of language. And he has a whole, history of evolution told through the lens of human design. So what's interesting to me is I feel like everyone is kind of aware. It's like it's in the air. Like no matter what system you're in, that these are the things that are happening. It's just the proximity versus it was almost ironic to me that human design is really giving you these things, but there are people who are like 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th, 9th, 10th generation. I'm 2nd generation. I mean, maybe 3rd. I never actually met Ross, so I guess I'm 3rd, but I've met his circle. So I guess that puts me as 3rd generation. I spent a week hanging out with people who lived with him for 7 years, So I've gotten some sort of transmission of 3rd generation. And then people I talk to become 4th generation. And then people they talk to become 5th generation, and so on, unless they talk to somebody closer. But what happens is when you get to the 10th or 15th generation, you get the same story, but all the characters are changed. So instead of the design being the unconscious, true sidereal is the unconscious. Instead of the right variable being the return of the understanding of the yin principle and the respect for women, you get true sidereal as the return of the feminine. And so it's just interesting to me how like the narrative remains the same, but the players change.
I feel like one of the biggest, and like I can speak to this just like strictly from my own experience, is I feel like one of the biggest obstacles to getting people together and really like discussing tropical versus sidereal versus true sidereal is that there is like deep ego entanglements, right? Like for me, you know how I mentioned, like I looked at this shit for like 2 years tracking these things, because initially when I saw my sidereal chart, which actually doesn't change in true sidereal, so for me it's kind of easy peasy, but when I saw it, I was like, no way in hell, right? Because I've formed attachments to these positions that I've allowed to be like, oh, well, this is who I am, which I think is something true that happens in any system. Mm-hmm. And so I think that that's a little bit of a stumbling block to, shall we say, diplomatic relations there. Absolutely, even just like an attempt to be curious, And with all of this, I think my biggest thing is just inviting people to like be a little bit curious. And like I said, I'm not going to speak to human design much because I'm just a bystander in all of this that's been going on. It's not my area of study. But but one thing that I have been like really drilling down on is the tropical sort of party line that I hear is that it was changed to be keyed to the seasons on purpose, right? And some say it was Ptolemy. And that
I will let you build this narrative. I disagree, but okay, go on.
Okay. That's what I've come up against a lot. That seems to be the explanation, like it was changed to the seasons on purpose. Tropical astrologers have known that it doesn't match up with the stars for a very, very long time because it was done so on purpose, and, I'm sure that that's not everyone's explanation, but it is one of the explanations that's out there. And, I went back and started reading Ptolemy's book on astrology, and I can't really find any evidence to that, because lots of people, not everyone, but lots of people attribute this change to him and essentially say like, oh, he knew that it wasn't supposed to be keyed to the stars. But back in the day, like all astrologers were astronomers.
Yeah. Well, and what my understanding of it, I don't know a ton about the history of it, but at least for several hundred years, if not over 1,000 years, but at least several hundred years, there have been competing systems of reference. And, I look at Kepler's formulas, for instance, and, Keplerian formula are already used in tropical. So Kepler was well aware of tropical and was using tropical and was calculating tropical. And what Kepler was doing, and the reason Kepler was using tropical, I mean, we still use sidereal too, like the moon is always in sidereal. The moon phases are 29.5 days, but the moon cycle around the ecliptic is 27.3 days. It's always sidereal. But in any case, Kepler, and I won't go too technical here because I don't want to misspeak. I would love to interview an astronomer. That would be a dream come true. But I've used the Keplerian formulas using right ascension and declination to calculate positions. For Kepler and for everyone past Kepler and probably even before Kepler, it was literally the signs and the constellations just happened to share the same names. But the signs were a shorthand or an easy way to refer to an equidistant 30-degree division of the cycle keyed to the 0-degree spring equinox. Because the fact of the matter is, the biggest, and again, I brought up David Chalmers earlier. David Chalmers said a language dispute is a dispute where if you change all the words, it goes away. Yeah. So literally, if we called them zonk and zob and bilk and blop, there would not even be a dispute because I'm only talking about a 30-degree, you know what I mean? But then it becomes to the,
But, which I agree with, right? But I think it's a useful exploration to ask, why we shifted to this, because.
Oh, it is. Well, but okay, but
back in the day, they were all looking up at the stars, and even from, this is the opening line of Tetrabiblos, which is the 4 books that Ptolemy did on astrology. Of the means of prediction through astronomy, Osiris, 2 are the most important and valid, so on. But like off the hop, it's a direct link to actually looking at the sky, Okay,
I'm going to disagree with you there. There were at least 15 different systems of sidereal. Nobody could agree. Tropical actually gives a uniform language that allows scientific progress or allowed scientific progress because people could.
Oh, sorry, finish your
sentence. No. I mean, but you see my point. Like my point is like, if they called them zonk and zob, like the reason that tropical emerged is because scientists needed a way to refer to a position relative to the season. So if they didn't use a constellation, they would have had to make a new name.
Assumption, right? But we need to, I think it's very imperative. Like if we were to go back in time to when he was doing all of this, of course it makes sense to link it to the seasons, because that appears to be the constant. But he believed the Earth was the center of the universe.
Well, yeah, but I'm talking like, let's take like Kepler, for instance. So Kepler would be a good example. So the Keplerian formula, so this is already up to the 1600s.
Okay, so what timeline is this happening?
1600s. So in the 1600s, Francis Bacon and all of the, proto-enlightenment and in human design, the beginning of the process of planning, for those who know human design. In any case, the beginning of our modern era, the beginning of industrialization, so on. What there was a need for was a way to refer to the position of the planet along the ecliptic, which is the celestial equator projected outward. And the fact of the matter is, if you refer to the planet relative to the constellation, there's no precision to the constellation. We have no way of actually knowing. Nobody can agree where Aries begins. So I'm 100% with you that I'm not saying, I guess what I'm trying to say is, I'm not trying to make a mark against sidereal. I'm just trying to say that even if from a purely astronomical perspective with nothing to do with astrology, it's necessary to create a 360-degree system. I mean, they didn't have to name them the signs. They could have just said, oh yeah, that's at 245 degrees. instead of saying that's at the beginning of Sagittarius or whatever, because it, as a computer programmer, it doesn't really make a difference to me whether I refer to it as a number between 0 and 359, or whether I refer to it as the 22nd degree of Aquarius, whatever. It doesn't make a difference. It's a nomenclature. It's a taxonomy. It's not really a difference. But whatever system I use, whether it's Blanc and Blorg or whether it's Aquarius and Capricorn, these are names that refer to positions along the ecliptic, which was a necessary development for astronomers to be able to communicate with each other, because the pre-tropical systems all disagreed and to this day disagree. And there are adherents of radically different sidereal systems. So it was a common language. It's kind of like English sucks, but it's become, and it was similarly to English, it was probably put forth by imperialism and by, you know what I mean? Like tropical, I would not be surprised to discover that tropical was like by force, like the kind of like homogenizing force. It's funny to me because I definitely don't have any, I'm not shedding any tears for tropical, you know what I mean? It's just that.
It's very tidy. It's the one where this is this exact degree and you know it. And like, that is definitely what it has going for it.
Okay, so if you have anything, I'm going to change gears. If you have any last things to say on this, but I want to change gears otherwise, just for.
Let's see. So yes, I agree. It's like very, very neat and tidy. And I mean, especially for human design, if you're going by like not even full degrees, then, but I think I do implore people who are interested in astrology to just like feel into it and see, right? Because I think that astrology still can be a very revelatory process, not necessarily in like such an epic, mind-blowing way that like you have a voice in your head for 6 days or whatever, but it's a conversation with the cosmos a little bit. And on one hand you're sort of right? This is a concept that Sabrina brought to my attention, Sabrina Monarch, who we both know, and that is sort of that that if you court the muses, they will speak to you in your language, right? So no matter what language you use, if you make the practice of showing up and letting the transmissions come through, you're still going to get things. But I think there's a depth that's interesting to be curious about.
This is actually a perfect segue, because what I was going to shift gears to was sort of my methodology for learning astrology. I hinted at it earlier with the buckets thing, the kind of, and I think that that's why it's unfortunate that the constellations have the same names as the signs, because really they should be separate buckets. And I like to, for people who don't really know astrology at all, I like to kind of say, like, just think about, create a bucket for the full moon and a bucket for the new moon, and put all the stuff that stands out about the new moon, and it's abnormal and unusual and kind of an anomaly and a singular event, and then put all the singular event that happens in the full moon. This is very similar to Chinese history. What Jung said when he studied Chinese history was that Western historians would have no idea how to interpret it because it was so holistic and it all came together. It's like the princess eloped and there was a famine and there was an avalanche down here, and like all these things are related to the Chinese system of belief because they're all seen to happen within the same bucket, within the same quality of time, rather than simply a chronological quantitative time. So that's kind of my fundamental belief, is that in learning astrology, you start to bucket things, you start to get a word for something that you can then track. And so what you're saying is feeling into it. I absolutely agree. And I think what it leads to is kind of Rick Tarnas's point, where he spent 15 years only looking at the synodic cycles of the outer planets. He only looks at 10 pairs of synodic, or 10 synodic cycles. He looks at, you're probably familiar with them, but he looks at Saturn, Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, and so on. Then he looks at Jupiter, other way around. But in any case, looking at only those, he was able to feel into it. And because he showed up, the muses brought him, Cosmos and Psyche, which is one of those beautiful artifacts of.
I have that book. I haven't read it yet, but I'm going to start.
It's a very easy read. People kind of criticize Rick Tarnas sometimes for being, I don't know, kind of. I mean, I can listen to him talk for hours, but people have been critical of him. But you know what? That book is an absolute masterpiece, and I will defend it to my grave. But in any case, I think that the whole idea of the buckets is to start creating buckets for things and then start putting things in those buckets.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that regardless of the bucket of what the stars do, we're going to need to have a bucket for what the summer solstice feels like. Because the summer solstice feels a certain way. And maybe that bucket will be different for somebody north or south of the equator. It's a good question. Or does the whole world feel a certain way? You know, I mean, we can make more precise buckets, but at a certain point, we have to ask ourselves, you know, maybe actually, even though it is the middle of winter in Australia when it's summer for me, maybe the summer solstice for me is still actually a certain quality of time that is felt in Australia. I don't know. I mean, that's a good question, right? Is there a quality of time that's not just based on the weather, but actually based on the annual cycle?
Yeah, but this is tricky a little bit, and this is what makes astrology impossible to become a science, shall we say, in the most strictest of terms these days, is because there's too many variables, you know, and it's not reproducible, because every summer solstice is going to have a slightly different quality of time due to everything that's happening.
Well, yeah. And then people have said, well, how come the astrology didn't predict the internet? And I say, well, it did. And they're like, what do you mean? I'm like, well, Neptune, Uranus. And they're like, well, that's not the internet. And I say, well, you look at every other Neptune, Uranus that's ever happened, and it's like internet theme. I mean, you have to be able to see, you have to have eyes to see. So that part of it doesn't bother me. Like, I'm okay with conventional scientists not getting it. I mean,
Yeah, that's fine.
when I was younger, I wanted to prove it to them. And now I'm just, now I'm like, I'll leave that for somebody else to prove. I don't really need to prove that. I mean, when I was younger, I wanted to, but I guess the whole idea of the buckets then for me becomes, how do we start to bucket things, and how do we, and like, what are the buckets? And so it's interesting. So I don't want to go too long. I would love to do a follow-up with you at some point. This has been such a wonderful conversation. We can talk about anything you want next time. But the one thing I do want to at least mention, without going into human design too much, is just how the buckets work. Is that there's this great material by Ra, where he really, I mean, he spent 2 years on this, and it was very in depth, and it culminated in 7 or 8 books of transcription of transcribed lectures, over 90 hours of lectures that he gave on the topic. And for about 12 of those hours, or 14 of those hours, he went deep into the fixed stars, the so-called fixed stars, which is, to me, is so funny that we call them that, because it's literally what is, you know, we're moving in relation to them. But in any case, the so-called fixed stars.
And they're moving, right?
What's that?
Like the planets tilting more than the stars themselves.
Yeah, the stars are fixed, but I guess so from our perspective,
they move too, I believe.
I suppose so. No, you're right. It's the tilt that's making it appear that they're moving, because it's relative to the ecliptic. I've looked at a bunch of 3D models of it, and I might have a couple for the interview next week, so I can show a 3D model, because it really helps.
Which is where it sort of does become important to like remember that, like, of course people thought that the stars were moving, because they thought that we were the fixed point, you know? Well,
and that we still use, basically, I mean, it's heliocentric to a degree, but when you look at the, I mean, it's still a geocentric projection of a heliocentric model. Okay, but the interesting thing is that in the materials that Ra did, what he basically did was he looked at particular stars and tried to find qualities of the stars. And I love this, because stars are one of my first loves, you know, and I've spent countless hours reading Chinese astrology and Arabic and alchemical. I mean, I don't know, I guess I can do a little, here's my library. It's like pretty much all Jung, alchemy, and then over there it continues, and I just pretty much have Jung and alchemy all around the house. And so, you know, I mean, the stars to me were like the one of the first things I really loved. So I love being able to read like Ra on Sirius, or Ra on you know, Aldebaran. But the only way he could do it, he's so much like me, he had to find ways to notice, because the thing is, the star is easier to pinpoint than the constellation. We know the exact degree of the star. So then the question becomes, how do you tell how that star affects you? What do? Look for people whose ascendant is conjunct the star? Well, my ascendant is conjunct Algol, precisely. But guess what? That's along the ecliptic, and Algol is up here. So is it really conjunct? I mean, it's a good question. So there's a lot of, you know, how do you bucket? Like, so he has an answer. Do you have your idea of how you would do it, or?
Well, I do think that this is a little bit of a tie-in to what you were saying earlier, personally, like the whole unconscious versus conscious, predictive versus psychological, neither of those categories are really my jam, but I do think there is a little bit to this idea of, it is a bit more of a masculine tendency to want those super, super exact, the exact calculations and to have like everything fit in neat buckets. And
Yeah.
it's useful for sure, but I think that it might also be useful to like allow a little bit of room for a bit more messiness too.
Absolutely. Well, and I guess so I completely agree. And Ra is also very, very left variable in human design. And without going so much into it, left variable has basically been around since 90,000 years ago. Right variable has been around for 200 years. So the people who have a lot of right variable tend to look like freaks and geniuses and weirdos. Ra is about as dinosaur as you can get. His entire human design is a pure survival integration being that would have been at home in 50,000 BC. He would have been hunting the, saber-toothed tiger and been just fine. So a lot of this, we can call it masculine, or we can call it left variable, or, survival oriented. I mean, it goes so deep. It goes to the whole dominator culture, stuff like Rianne Eisler, Chalice and the Blade. This is very much about left variable. And Ra was sort of the announcer of the closing of the door on the left variable process and the bringing, well, really it started around 1960 when we moved into the first line of, we basically, I won't go into the global cycles, but in any case, there is a human design explanation for the emergence of what has been called the divine feminine, but is also could be seen as a holistic form of cognition that is not survival based. It's about having resources and being available and so on. But in any case, what Ra kind of argues is that the left variable process is logical and survival and splenic oriented. The right variable process is holistic and emergent and experiential and so on, and singular. You can't really put it into categories as much or at all. But instead, you extract things from it. So almost all of his experiments, everything he was doing was logic. Because he said, basically, the experiential is going to be filled in by you. Like he's going to give you the blueprint and you can kind of see what you get from it. So he was absolutely approaching it the way an engineer would approach an engineering problem. How do I determine how this star affects me? And what he came up with was pretty ingenious. What he came up with was he basically used almost the example of what they call the low shoe and the ho shoe, of the fixed wheel versus the moving wheel. And this might be a good place to end today because I was aiming for an hour. I think we're at almost an hour. I don't want to keep you all day, but I'd love to do a follow-up soon. But this might be a nice place to end, and I'll give you a chance to comment on, obviously, too. But just the idea that what he did was he tracked the history of the movement of the stars. And he looked at how they moved against the lines of the hexagrams. And this is actually precisely what he does with the global cycles as well, where, for instance, just to give you like a tiniest little taste of it, for the past 400 years, according to human design cosmology, the family has been one of the biggest things. There's been a huge push towards family. And the spirit of humanity has been in the family. And the temple where we worship has been aloneness. We didn't really have aloneness before 400 years ago. And we've got more and more and more aloneness. And the bargain between the aloneness and the family has created a bargain that's created the 9-to-5 work week that says, I will work and provide. The core fear of the time, because every era has a core fear, has been the fear of failure, the fear that my kid won't go to college, the fear of financial failure. And it's very material and financial. All of that is changing. The new fear is the fear of the unknown. It is the new spirit is going into individuality and melancholy and being personal, that nobody can get to it. So we're giving up on families. We're giving up on the family bond and the family unit. The new temple is moving out of aloneness into personal empowerment in gate 34. So it's not about being alone anymore. It's about being empowered in yourself.
Where does this start?
And well, we're already feeling it since 1960. This is the prelude, but it kicks into high gear in 2027.
Okay.
And we're in the final 7-year run up.
It's definitely starting to kick into high gear from my experience anyway.
Yeah. And there's so many more of these. I mean, that's a little teaser, but there's, so many of these where basically by observing how the stars are moving and how the kind of cycles are clicking against each other, you get all sorts of really interesting juxtapositions. And basically he says, the way Ra puts it in his poetic language is that there are perennial locks, and the perennial locks are all found in the G center in human design, and they correlate to the 8 pagan holidays. And those are the celebrations of the 8 locks. And they're the 8 locks of the 8 different aspects of humanity. 4 are related to love, 4 are related to direction. And then the keys are always changing. And how to get to that is going to change. And that's 100% sidereal. From the beginning, Ra even says, this is the sidereal. The sidereal is the key to get to the lock. So it's kind of almost ironic that, and I'm going to talk to Richard about this next week, but I don't want to, there's gonna be a lot more clarity next week, but I want to ask him about his calculations and if he feels like he's applied the calculation twice, because I almost think that the calculation's already been applied because Ra already uses the calculation of sidereal in determining the quality of the lock and key. Basically, he says there's a sidereal key and there's a tropical lock, and the keys are constantly shifting,
Right.
And so, I mean, this is just something that I'm mostly, I'm still not totally clear on it. And I'm really excited to talk to Richard, because I want to, I think everybody is. I think there's a lot of questions coming up. So, but if you have any questions for him also, or any comments on that last bit about locks and keys, or any questions that you think I should ask him.
This is definitely lighting something up, this idea of, so you're saying that the sidereal is the key to tropical locks?
Yeah, the tropical never changes because it's permanent. It's always the same, but every era has a changing condition. So basically, yeah.
This is super interesting, actually. I was just like walking outside yesterday and thinking about, so there's all this talk right now about how we're in the age of Aquarius, and there's like so many planets in Aquarius. And I have a hard time not looking at this situation and seeing it being thoroughly Capricorn with all of the like government restrictions and stuff like that, right?
We are also in a Saturn conjunction, but yeah.
Yeah. And this like just like major issues with business, etc. I won't go on too long for that. But yesterday, I was realizing how Neptune is in Aquarius. And I feel like we're having a lot of experiences of just like we put our like communities and societies up on such a pedestal, and there's just so much disillusionment and so much disappointment in everything that it isn't. And also with technology too, right? Sort of hoping that it will save us, and then being like lost in the Neptune fog of, oh, like, is this helping or isn't it? And personally, I think it is, but but I had this realization that like all of these illusions and disillusions that are happening with like society as a whole and how we connect to each other as community are actually sort of the base building blocks that we need to experience in order to get to the level of this like age of Aquarius that we want to see. So hearing you say that this locks and keys thing, that is lighting
it's a fun way to look at it. And oh yeah, and when you say Neptune, you mean Neptune's in the constellation of Aquarius, right? I haven't checked for a while, but that's what I thought. Okay, yeah. I was like, did it move? Did it go retrograde? What's going on? Okay, no.
Constellation,
well, yeah, and I think that is important. I mean, it is important to look at the constellation. To me, I mean, the star, and maybe I'm very left variable, so I'm an engineer, but to me, I want to pinpoint. I'm like, can we even just get to the star? Can we just talk about the star in the constellation and what that does? And, because that to me has been one of the greatest mysteries. Yeah. And that's something that, the other, there's a lot more to follow up on. And also once I talk to Richard, I'm gonna have a lot more clarity. I imagine, I have the gate of confusion in human design. So most often when I come to things, and I used to hide this, but now I just kind of embrace it to say, really confused about this. I really do not know how this works. Please help dispel my confusion. And sometimes it happens, sometimes it doesn't. Well, I want to just thank you. I think it's been absolutely wonderful having you on. So I'm just going to give a little shout out again. Rio Larmand, Cosmic Wizard Astrology on Instagram, and I'll be putting a website link and stuff like that in the YouTube. And say hi to Sabrina if you talk to her. And Yeah,
It's lovely
it's been great.
speaking with
I
you.
really appreciate that. Thank you so much. So, all
All
right,
right.
take
Have a good
care.
night.
Okay,
Okay.
I'm just gonna stop recording.